Okay, so this is part 3. This section is in particular about the Islamic Golden Age after the Caliphate of the rightly guided ones. That territory expands even farther by the Umayyad caliphs. And one of the key distinctions between the earlier caliphs and the later ones is that after Ali, the next caliph then allows his son to inherit, essentially making the caliphate nothing different from an absolutist monarchy, right? An inherited monarchy. So under the Umayyads, Islam spreads even farther into Central Asia and North Africa, and it makes it all the way up into the Iberian Peninsula, where it becomes a thorn in the side of Christendom and the Holy Roman Empire in particular. And then you have, after the Umayyad Caliphate ends in 750, so that's a dynasty where they have, the Caliphate is passed down through inheritance. Then you have the next Caliphate is the Abbasid Caliphate. And what ends up happening is when that war between the Umayyad and the Abbasids breaks out, the empire ends up splitting into multiple pieces, and the Umayyad, thank you, are left. Oh, you want mommy to put the necklace on? Is that great? Okay.
Hi. Hi.
So after the Umayyad Caliphate falls, they are left a little bit of territory in the Iberian Peninsula, but that's all that's left for them. And we have kind of the bulk of the Muslim world is under the control of the Abbasids, but we have a couple of other pieces of political powers that are also in majority Muslim areas, right? Notably in Central Asia and North Africa. After that, you have the Fatimid Caliphate. And if you'll remember, Fatima was Muhammad's only surviving offspring, and she married Ali. So the Shiites consider themselves as the followers of Ali, and the Fatimid Caliphate derives its sense of validity from their lineage.
I love you.
I love you too. To Muhammad through Fatima.
Me?
Yes, that is a ring. They are unusually Shiite. And so this moment for the screen, yes. This moment for the Fatimid Caliphate is actually the only time that we have a majority of the Muslim world under Shiite control. And that's in more than one place. Would you like to go with Grammy? So the end of the caliphates doesn't necessarily mean the end of the spread of Islam throughout the world. And so this is kind of our last map here, but it's really just to highlight the area that was, the purple area is the farthest extent of the Umayyad dynasty at its end. And then you have, it extends farther into Africa and Central Asia and northern India. But right around the same time as you get those yellow extensions, you also get the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula. And so that's where Christian forces, having utterly failed at the Crusades in the Levant, start trying to reconquer the Iberian. No, let's rephrase that. They're not reconquering. They are conquering because it wasn't like necessarily originally Christian unless you're going to go all the way back to Rome, right? So this is a conquest of the Iberian Peninsula that is justified as a re-Christianization. And that takes quite a long time, actually. It's not fully completed until around 1500. And as Spain becomes fully Christianized, under Ferdinand and Isabella, yes, that Ferdinand and Isabella, the rest of Africa and large portions of Central Asia and India, and now Southeast Asia, they have all been influenced by Islam, which has spread almost globally at this point. Not quite, because we have the Western Hemisphere, but as far as the Afro-Eurasia counts, Islam has made it kind of everywhere. So I want to talk a little bit about the intellectual developments of the Islamic Golden Age. And I'm going to start with Sufism, which is a particular kind of Islamic mysticism. And it is reactionary because it's pushing back against imperial Islam, an idea of Islam where conquest is justified. In traditional Islamic law, war is not okay unless it is a just war, which means defensive war against oppressors, right? So not only did someone else attack you, that someone is more powerful. So imperial Islam that is conquering areas without having been oppressed is contrary to the teaching of Islam. And the Sufis are really resisting that. They're also resisting the increasing rigidity of the Islamic legal scholars of the ulama who are determining orthodoxy, right? So Sufism resists both of those moves, and it emphasizes sort of the simplicity of individual spiritual practice. They use asceticism, they emphasize detachment from worldly things and poverty, and they are trying to seek union with the divine through the practice of self-annihilation, which should remind you of some of the other syncretic religions that we learned about. Because Sufism is at its core the most syncretic model of Islam. It absorbs the beliefs and customs of the regions that become under Islamic control, but are outside of the Arabic world. And so, Arab world. And so a lot of the people living there don't initially or fully convert to Islam in an orthodox sense, and instead you find a blending of Islamic and local traditions and customs. In India, for example, that Sufism will then incorporate meditation and certain ideas about enlightenment, and in other places it will take on other characteristics of the local religion. And I like this quote from Reza Aslan. He says, Sufis believe that reason and theology, creed and ritual, law and its commandments all must be replaced in the soul of the enlightened person with the supreme virtue, which is love. And that actually is not very far from what St. Augustine says of the proper interpretation of Christianity. At some point, Augustine says, look, we're all going to get some of this wrong. So the basic function here is if you can look at your interpretation of the scripture and it comes down to love, you probably got it mostly right. And if you can look at your interpretation of the scripture and what you get instead are rules, hatred, war, then you probably got it wrong. And that's his essential guideline for figuring out how wrong your understanding of the scripture is, because it's always a little wrong. So Augustine, who really influenced the European Middle Ages through his understanding of Christianity, gets to the same kind of conclusion that we see with later Sufi mystics in Islam, and that aligns with other religious groups and practices. So there's an interesting thread or commonality between all these different practices across cultures. Now, in addition to Sufism, we also see massive changes in learning and science and technology. And so I want to talk a little bit about factors that might have influenced the Golden Age, because it really is incredible. First might be Islam's own emphasis on education and madrasas as their kind of local schools within the mosques. The second factor is relative peace and stability, and that's in particular that applies under the caliphates, because the more stability you have, the more people can put their focus on non-survival activities, right? Another factor might be the Hellenic inheritance of the Eastern Mediterranean and Levant region, because we already had a lot of exchange of people, goods, and ideas in part of this world. And so as the caliphate overlaps with Hellenism or Hellenistic cultures, then it takes on some of the richest parts of that culture's legacy. Also, paper. Never underestimate the power of the material technology of knowledge, which we acknowledge that paper was invented by the Chinese, but it had made it to the Muslim world in the 8th century, and they created paper mills. So they manufactured paper in a more efficient fashion, which allowed them to have more paper and therefore more books. And it had made it all the way through the Muslim world to the far end in Spain, which is Al-Andalus, the Iberian Peninsula. It's not Spain at this point in history, by the 10th century. So pretty early. I will comment that paper is not popular as a medium in Europe until around 1450, and that's just because Europe is using parchment, which has a lot more durability. And so paper doesn't become popular in Europe largely because, let's say paper doesn't become popular in Europe until the lower cost of paper is so much lower than the cost of parchment that the weighing starts to tip in favor of the cheaper medium, right? So, because most of the time they're like, if I want a book and I want it to last, I'm going to put it on parchment. And so you don't see a lot of paper, even though it's available. And then there comes a point where the paper, because it's being mass manufactured, gets so cheap that people are like, yeah, it's not durable, but this is a lot more for parchment. And so then they start using paper. So right around 1450 in Europe, you see 50% of books are parchment and 50% are paper. And before that, paper is just not very common, right? It's more common in the Islamic world, largely because they start using it before parchment, not before it's available, but before it's like widely available in the region. And I would suggest, as a historian of material media myself, that the other reason that parchment remains dominant in Europe and not in the Islamic world is humidity. So I have spent many hours in manuscript repositories, and let me tell you, the paper books mold. They really, really mold in England in particular, which is a very damp place. And I know immediately upon opening a paper book whether or not it's molding because I start sneezing. So I have a whole getup of like PPE that I take into repositories for when I have to look at paper manuscripts, because they affect me that much. And so I would suggest that one of the reasons that paper is popular in the Islamic world is that they don't have to worry as much about mold in the drier climate, right? So paper lasts better than papyrus in a dry climate, and it doesn't require quite the labor-intense practice that parchment does. And so if you don't have this problem of molding, then it's an ideal surface on which to write, right? Here's just a lovely example of a Quran on paper. Also, we talked about last time the legal schools and the legal traditions, but I wanted to just point out that not only do you have the formation of distinct schools of Islamic law, but you also have the institution of issuing diplomas, right? The invention of the diploma happens as a direct result of the codification of these different schools of law. And this becomes really interesting because to get a diploma that says that you are certified in mastery of this particular set of knowledge, you end up aligning yourself with one particular school. Whereas the vast majority of practicing Muslims didn't have that kind of alignment. And instead, they would kind of cherry pick. They're like, well, I like the Maliki school on that one, but they're kind of rough in this other area. So in that case, I go with this other school. So actual practicing Muslims would mix and match, but your diploma would belong to one school. The rest of what we're going to discuss is literally a hit parade because there were so many advancements in science and medicine and thought and philosophy that I can't possibly cover it all. So I'm going to hit some of the highlights. And part of what I want you to take away from this is how impressive the quantity of these changes is, right? So math, this is where we start. Arabic numerals, we use them today. Before that, you had Roman numerals, not so good. Algebra, the concept of a function, analytical geometry, right? With coordinates. So what we think of as Cartesian geometry, that's actually already invented by the time that Descartes starts using it. So that's a thing. The general solution to the cubic equation, of course. Trigonometry, of course. Particularly the law of sines, which gives you information about a triangle without it having to be a right triangle. Calculus, not all calculus, but certain features of calculus. Al-Khaldun in particular, he deduced the formula for the sum of the fourth power, and he used it to find the volume of a paraboloid. And then he also developed the concept of an integral formula for polynomials. So he didn't create a general equation for an integral, but he developed the idea, which allows later calculus thinkers to come along with that. And if you seized up a little bit in terror because you're not a math person, my apologies. But we have all of these things thanks to the Islamic Golden Age. And that also leads to some really amazing changes in architecture, particularly in the Islamic region. What you're looking at here is the Alhambra Palace in Andalusia, which is in Spain. But it's just mind-blowing how incredibly beautiful the geometric art forms of the Islamic age are. And these happen because there are prohibitions against the creation of icons and imagery. And even when we looked at manuscript depictions of Muhammad, we saw that his face was covered because it is I don't know the right word in for Islam, but in Christianity you would use the term anathema, right? It's sacrilegious to depict the face of God's messenger. And so figures aren't very common in Islamic art. And instead, the unity and beauty of creation and God are represented in these really intricate geometric designs. Now, so that's math, geometry, and even some art. Let's talk about the scientific method, which in the West, we're like, oh, Francis Bacon. No, not Francis Bacon. Aristotle. This manuscript is actually an Arabic manuscript of Plato, and it depicts Socrates. But, right, Socrates teaches Plato, teaches Aristotle. So, voila, teaches Alexander. So Aristotle is the foundational empiricist. He's the person who emphasizes observation as the basis for rationality. But Ibn Sina, who gets Latinized to Avicenna in the West, and Ibn Rushdi, create Arabic commentaries on Aristotle's works. And in those commentaries, they essentially elaborate a much more involved and advanced version of the scientific method. And these end up eventually in Europe by way of Al-Andalus, which is now Spain. So these works, these commentaries on Aristotle, are happening because Aristotle has been translated from Greek into Arabic. Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushdi are working in Arabic, and they write these Arabic commentaries. And then in Andalusia, which actually is where Ibn Sina lives, but Ibn Rushdi, I believe, is Persian. But anyhow, Ibn Sina and other Islamic scholars are coming into contact with the Christian world a lot. And so these works get translated into Latin. And once they get translated into Latin, they make their way into Europe. And once they are in Europe, they now start influencing European thought towards empiricism. And yes, this happens before the so-called scientific revolution. Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon, not Francis, Roger, they're both writing about empiricism inspired by these Arabic commentaries on Aristotle, right? So there's a direct lineage, Aristotle, Arabic commentators, and then European thinkers. And it's these two European thinkers who then start articulating the ideas of empiricism in Latin, which spreads it into European culture. And this is the 12th century, guys. And what's interesting, side note, is I did not understand how widespread Latinate literature of Arabic science was in the Middle Ages until a student of mine did a project studying the corpus of one of Chaucer's most popular works, right? Chaucer, as in Canterbury Tales, that guy. He actually, his second most copied work is a treatise on the astrolabe that he wrote for his son. And my student used my methodology to track the copies of the treatise on the astrolabe, and then also to track the other works that it was copied with in its manuscripts. And what he discovered in the process is that actually there was an entire corpus of Latin translations of Arabic astronomers that this Chaucer piece was circulating with. And so there's an entire scientific culture happening at the end of the Middle Ages that we don't talk about because they're not people who are writing their own things. It's translations of the Islamic world, and people are learning from that. And that is where the scientific revolution in Europe comes from, is these Latin translations of Arabic texts. And one of the most influential of these, not just Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushdi, but al-Khaldun. So he is the one who perfects the scientific method from Aristotle. So he doesn't just say, okay, yes, observation, that's important, but he essentially articulates experimental design, right? And the use of inductive reasoning from what you know through observation and experimentation to make very scientific conclusions, right? Al-Khaldun is the one who adds that to our practice. So let us discuss major scientific achievements. Al-Tusi creates the Tusi couple. This becomes the model that Copernicus uses to describe a heliocentric universe. Al-Khaldun, who we just talked about, develops the best theory of optics to date, as in that date, not this date, arguing, so at that point, some folks think that vision works because light is like a substance that emanates from objects and then enters the eyes. And then other people think that light is a substance that emanates from the eyes and then gets bounced back by objects. And Al-Khaldun is like, well, maybe light is just a thing. And it travels in a straight line, and then it reflects off of objects and lands in the eyes. Voila. Actually, he's pretty close there. That's pretty close to how it works. And he has an entire diagram of how the eyes work and the optic nerve connects to the brain. And then you also have al-Biruni, who estimates the radius of the Earth. You have massive developments of medicine, and this is really important because this cannot happen in the European Middle Ages because of the control of the church over institutions of learning. So in Christianity, it is forbidden to dissect a corpse because there is a belief in the literal resurrection of the body at the end of time, and so you can't desecrate bodies by cutting them apart to study them. There is no such prohibition in Islam, and so you have gross anatomy. That's how people learned how to practice medicine. Now, Ibn al-Nafis, he's kind of an amazing dude. He's a 13th century polymath, and he correctly figured out how the cardiopulmonary system works. So that's like your heart, lungs, all of that, and how oxygenation works. He also, unrelated, correctly conjectured that the brain is the part of your body that does your thinking and your sensing, and not the heart, which is what other people had proposed. Rhazes was a 9th century Persian polymath. His most notable discovery, because boy did he have a lot, is of the nervous system. And he basically figured out that nerves have their sensory motor function. And he diagrammed the 7 cranial nerves, so coming out of the brainstem, and the 31 spinal cord nerves, which he numbered and labeled and essentially gave it the taxonomy that we use today to identify all of these nerves. In addition to all of this, here are some other highlights of evidence-based medicine, not attached to particular people, but to what the culture at large produced. There's a break from Galen and humoral theory, right? The idea that illnesses come from an imbalance of the humors. That is the primary medical practice in Europe through the Renaissance. Instead, in the Islamic world, they're thinking about non-humoral causes of diseases, which looks like it might have been proven or might have been solidified by Ibn Zur in 12th century Al-Andalus, because he discovered that scabies is caused by an itch mite and not by an imbalance of the humors. And so that leads to other discoveries. So here's Rhazes again. He does some early epidemiology, figuring out the difference between smallpox and measles. And then you also have, he did a really weird hygiene test, and I like it. So hygiene practices are a major innovation in the Islamic world. In this particular example, what he does is, in determining the best place to put a hospital, he put meat, raw meat, at various locations around the city, and they built the hospital at the location where the meat rot was the least, I don't know, where after a certain period of time, the meat was the least rotten, or took the longest to rot. I don't know. But that was like early hygienic science. And then you have surgery. Al-Zahrawi, he's a 10th century Arab physician, and he's known as the father of surgery. They already used cauterization of wounds, but he innovated on that, specifically suggesting that cauterization is best with iron rather than gold. He also invented over 200 surgical devices. So these are not torture devices, these are surgical devices. He even pioneered neurosurgery, including operations through the temple for migraines that were successfully treating migraines. He also pioneered the use of catgut or animal intestines for stitching on internal organs, so that wouldn't become a toxic thing left in one's body. And he described the ligature of blood vessels as a possible thing 600 years before Western surgeons figured that out. So pretty amazing advances in surgery happening in the Islamic Golden Age. This also includes hospitals, this emphasis on medicine and the science of the body. They created hospitals. The first large one was established in 805 in Baghdad, but it operated like a modern hospital. It's divided into departments according to various health concerns. It usually houses a medical school where the students accompany their treating physicians, and they also start issuing diplomas through their medical schools, and then these degrees become requirements for practicing medicine. So you have the professionalization of both law and medicine during this period. And they have a division of labor here because of the Islamic laws about chastity and sexual purity. So male doctors saw male patients and female doctors saw female patients. And yes, you read that right, female doctors, right? They also created outpatient clinics for things that didn't require hospitalization but still needed medical attention. So instead of the doctor coming to you, you go to the doctor. And they created mental health hospitals. And this is perhaps the most important component and aligns most ethically with Islam and its requirement that the needs of the poor be tended, it was forbidden for any of these institutions to turn away patients who were unable to pay for their medical care. So socialized medicine, kind of. And then we have maps, geography, and navigation, right? So Islamic folks are traveling all over the world at this point, right? They dominate the known world, and they live at this nexus of 3 continents. And so, yes, they're traveling into China, and yes, they are responsible for the early pioneering, and that's not the right word. Maybe it kind of is. But anyway, the early establishment of the Silk Road, because they're traveling back and forth between China and their own regions. And this is what allows Europe to get access to the goods from the Silk Road. This is not an invention of Marco Polo. He is just following other people's footsteps. So they're actually really well-traveled, widely traveled, very knowledgeable in navigation and astronomy. This happens to be a fine example of their cartography. It is, we would consider it to be upside down. So when we turn it the other way, you can kind of see what we're really looking at here, right? Africa. Here we go. There's Africa. Here's the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant. This would be Turkey and Greece. And this is, so the Mediterranean. Here's Italy, Iberia. This is Northern Europe. I assume some of these islands must be Britain and Ireland somewhere. But then you also have, this is the Indian subcontinent, and then all the way around the other side to China, and this would be Southern Africa. And so all of these are represented. This is not meant to be a literal cartography, just like the Mappa Mundi isn't when we get to that. But it is a representation of the relationship between everything in the known world. But of course, it's the other direction, right? South is up. South is the orienting principle. We just flip it this way so that we can recognize the features. Then you have Ibn Khaldun, who is a very interesting fellow. He is not really a scientist. He's a historian, a sociologist, and an economist. So he writes a world history. So this is a major invention. We talked about this when we talked about theories of history. But he writes this kind of cosmic history from the beginning of time right up to his present moment. He is also a budding sociologist. So here are some of the things that he does. Here are some of the things that he thinks a lot about that we would call sociological. So he describes the contrasting cultures between sedentary and nomadic societies. He also develops the idea of social cohesion in the sense of like tribalism and a group have a unit, a social unit having a sense of belonging. And he proposed a theory of sociological history, and this is about like the rise and fall of civilizations, where essentially he says that a society will reach its high point and maximum social cohesion, and once it does, after that, it will experience decay, which means that the next group that comes in that demonstrates strong social cohesion will actually be invaders, outsiders. He calls them barbarians, or people that the old society would consider to be barbaric, and after they come in and they conquer the space, they assimilate to some of the higher points of the earlier culture, and they become refined, and then this process repeats itself. And I think it's worth pausing to ask ourselves whether or not we believe that this is an adequate model of history, and if so, which is a big if, where are we now? And finally, I want to point out that he did a lot of thinking about economics as well. And several things that we still think a lot about are first thought about by Ibn Khaldun. So value added as something that happens in the process of production, division of labor, the idea of scarcity, the idea of economic growth, and in particular, he spent a lot of time thinking about the causes of poverty, right? Lots of stuff, lots of thinking. So rather than just go on and on and on and on, I am also going to highlight a few other of the major inventions from the Islamic Golden Age. This is a photo of an astrolabe, but you also have hydraulics and fountains and musical machines like automatic flute playing machines, valves, funnels, cranks, hydrochloric acid, alcohol distillation, glass manufacturing, the idea of the food chain, lamps, sugar mills, decimals, sextants, drug trials, magnifying glasses, pinhole cameras, and coffee. Oh, coffee. And guitars, clocks, sundials. All of these come from this period in history, from this culture. So imagine how many of these, I mean, some of them you're like, yeah, I could probably live without the astrolabe. But you wouldn't have gotten to this society that we live in without the astrolabe. I'll tell you that for sure, right? You wouldn't have Chaucer without the astrolabe. That is the massive, massive quantity of just absolutely overwhelming brilliance that comes from the Islamic Golden Age. You know, we'll end on this slide. We'll talk from here. This is such an important moment in global history because all of these inventions and all of these knowledge practices go on to influence cultures all over the world, right? And what ends up happening a lot, we talked about Columbusing in an earlier lecture. What happens a lot is European people will pick up ideas and then somehow later, Europe will forget that those ideas were not new when their big thinkers picked them up. Like Descartes didn't invent Cartesian coordinates, right? Newton actually didn't invent calculus out of nowhere. He was working on an existing knowledge culture heavily influenced by the achievements of the Islamic world. So when we tell stories about the history of European achievements, we might need to be very careful about crediting those achievements to European people because most of the time things don't get invented out of nowhere, right? Instead, they come from a culture of learning, they have a history, and then we have people who pick them up and use them in new ways. So Copernicus proposes a heliocentric universe. That's great. The sun is at the center of the universe. That is how we understand the working of the solar system today, but that would not have been possible without Al-Tusi and the Tusi couplet, right? So I think it's really important that we contextualize our modern histories of our own culture by acknowledging the debts that we owe to other cultures that gave us, if not the very technologies we're using, then certainly the seeds of those ideas in their own robust intellectual cultures. All right, so that's the end of this portion on the Islamic Golden Age. This next little bit, the epilogue, is just kind of fast forwarding what happened to Islam since the Golden Age.